Today on Think Smart with TMFG, Mike and I are going to be discussing Don't Worry, Be Happy. Things are actually improving. Mike, I read an interesting article by Ben Carlson, one of the people we've talked about a lot on our podcast, great writer, and he did a little perspective on money that I thought was very interesting. And I realized we're doing that, we're recording this the day after a major hurricane has just ripped through Florida and caused, tornadoes and flooding and loss of life and property damage. And we've got a couple of wars going on.
The world always seems horrible, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And I think one of the issues that we're dealing with is that because of all of the information we get today, last night you could watch the hurricane live. You can watch the aftermath today and everything that's been damaged, all the people who are, homeless and all of that right away.
In your life, have you ever heard a day where someone said, everything's perfect today? There's nothing going on wrong in the world.
Well, maybe in your life, everything could be perfect, but in the world...
I've never had one day where someone could come up and say, there's nothing wrong today.
I think it's also interesting that the headlines that we read in the paper are often a lot worse than what's happened. Maybe this isn't fair the day after a hurricane, but I've talked about this in a previous podcast. I remember a time I'm checking into a hotel in Los Angeles. I was going to a conference, and this person said, how are those riots going in Toronto? Like, you're from Toronto. It must be terrible there. And I go, what riots? And he goes, well, it was on the news last night that you've got riots. And there was a G7 conference, and there were people marching up and down Yonge Street for 2 blocks, and it was a perceived riot.
Yeah, like you think if Vancouver loses a hockey game, the whole town goes on fire, right?
Right.
There's one burnt car during that, and that makes out for what Vancouver's like. And I've been to Vancouver. It's nothing like that.
So let's go through some of the evidence. We're always talking about we're evidence-based advisors. What's some of the evidence that things are getting better? And we're going to go to what we call extreme poverty. So in 1900, 60% of the population were living on this planet in extreme poverty.
Yep.
By 1950, 50 years later, it was down to 50%. In the year 2000, it was down to 30%. Today, in 2024, it's down to 17%. It's almost halved itself in the last 24 years.
Well, you've seen these countries, like when we were kids, they used to say, all the starving kids in China. And I'm sure there's a lot going on. There's still tremendous poverty in China, but China's went from being a true, emerging market to being one of the leading GDPs in the world. So with that comes wealth and comes, reduction of poverty.
So let's talk about poverty. Poverty has not disappeared. People around the world are still struggling to afford housing, heating, transportation, healthy food for themselves, for their families. The extreme poverty line, I use that word extreme, it's a low barrier. They live on less than $2.15 a day. So there's still 16% of the world's population that are living on less than that. If you go to $10 a day, so almost 5 times that amount, 56% of the world's population are living on $10 a day. If you go to $30 a day, this one absolutely blew me away. 86% of the world's population are living on less than $30 a day. So in 2024, let's flip it around, 14% of the population lives on more than $30 a day in 2024. That's a big difference.
Big change.
We're lucky. We were born in North America. You and I were born to good families. We went to good schools. We actually went both to the University of Western Ontario for not just we had good high schools. You went to the U.S. for some, to Canada for some. I was just in Canada. And we've been very lucky, and we have to respect that. But this podcast is going out to mostly people who, most of them are in Canada. We've got a few that subscribe from around the world. So let's talk about wealth and happiness, Mike. What are some of the things that connect wealth and happiness?
I read a study once, and it was interesting. It was talking about the relationship between the two. And to say there's no relationship between wealth and happiness isn't true. There is. But it's a relationship up to the point where you become average wealth, right? So if you're poor, and you're starving, you're struggling to feed your family, it's going to create tension and unhappiness. It's very tough to be happy in that environment. But once you get to the point where you had sort of average wealth, when people go beyond that, it doesn't seem to increase their happiness anyway. And it was an interesting study because you keep on thinking, if I had this, if I had that, I'll be much happier. It really doesn't have that effect when they do studies of people. You know, whether you drive a little fishing boat or you drive a yacht, the people in the yachts are no happier than the person that's driving their little bass boat fishing around the lake, right?
So here's the evidence. People in richer countries tend to be happier. So call that North America, parts of Europe, parts of Asia, etc. They're richer countries. They have more wealth per country, and the people tend to be happier. Even in those countries, richer people, those, even above a certain level, like if you take the average, those are above the average are happier.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a connection that if you want to be happier, money plays a role in that.
Yeah.
The amount of wealth that you have. The problem is we always compare, we always live in the gap. So, Mike, we learned the gap concept really at the Strategic Coach. So talk a bit about the gap.
The gap is where you want to be and where you are. And people always, particularly people who are business people, their goal is always to get to this next level. And they're never quite satisfied with where they are. But the problem is there's always a next level. There's always someone richer. There's always someone more successful. There's always someone that you want to be. And even when you get to this point you've been trying to get to all your life, once you get there, you're not happy.
So is it a good thing that we always want more?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's part of, it makes capitalist society work, right? I mean, we always talk about there's the different mottos of capitalism and communism and stuff, and we find the capitalist part, like in the U.S. and Canada, it's because people are always striving to get a bit more, and it seems to work better than any other. As they say, capitalism is a terrible system, but it's the best of all the worst, right? Give me another system that works better than it.
So if we go back to those people living at or below the poverty line, they want to get out of that.
Yep.
They're human just like us. They have the same ambitions, and maybe it's just to get a job. Maybe that gets them out of the poverty line, whatever it may be. Maybe it's to get their first home. Maybe it's to get out of renting a home. Whatever it may be, they want more. And that's good for us. I know there's going to be the naysayers that say it isn't good for us. You always want more. That's how we progress in society.
The way that China has come out of being a massively poverty-ridden country is through, even though it's communist, capitalism has been built in China. And as that capitalism is built, and you see the people who are coming over here with the money for them, as they let people run business and grow them in China, and they've started to move into that sort of model, that's created. It's the only thing that really breaks those bonds of poverty is capitalism and free markets.
So at the end of the day, I think, as we live through this turbulent world that we live in, we've got to look to the other side. And, I know some publications and some radio stations and so on have tried to just present the good news. Unfortunately, no one ever listens or reads their publications enough that they survive.
Yep.
My take is you've got to remember to, I guess, accept the fact that we're so lucky we live in Canada. With the freedoms we have. We're in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And those of you that are listening to this podcast are even a very select group. If you're one of our clients, you've got your financial affairs in order. Life could be a lot worse. That brings us to the end of another week. Thank you for joining us. This is Rob and Mike with Think Smart from the McClelland Financial Group of Asante Capital Management.